Chapter 2. The place where most stories of my work would begin, I suppose, is with my finding of the potato seed ball that gave me the Burbank potato. That was an important discovery to me, and it did set my feet finally and successfully on my road. But I have thought often lately that if it had not been the potato, it would have been something else. For I was determined before that time to find the vulnerable spot in nature and make her my co-worker with plants. Nothing could have delayed me long, and it was only fortunate, probably, that the incident of the potato came as it did, and so hurried things on for me somewhat. The potato story has been told again and again, often correctly, and I'm only going to summarize it here. In New England, we grew large quantities of potatoes, but they were generally small, of a reddish color, and few of them good keepers. It required no genius to know that if a large white fine-grained potato could be produced, it would displace the other varieties and give its discoverer a great advantage over its competitors. I tried crossing with poor results, for the hybridized blossoms produced no seed, and selecting led me nowhere. Then I found a potato seed ball. I use an exclamation point. That is because, well, it was what an astronomer would use if he discovered a new solar system. A potato seed ball was not unheard of, but it was a great rarity, and I couldn't learn anyone who had done anything about the event even when it occurred. I did something. I planted the seeds in that ball. I had 23 seeds and I got 23 seedlings. From that whole number, although there were many that were an improvement on any potato then grown, I selected two that were amazing, valuable, and a distinct type. They were as different from the old early rows as the beef cattle of today are different from the old Texas Longhorn. It was from the potatoes of these two plants, carefully raised, carefully dug, jealously guarded, and painstakingly planted the next year, that I built the Burbank potato. And it was from the Burbank potato that I made my beginning as a plant developer. Not only did the new potato prove to me that nature was ready to cooperate and collaborate with man, but it made a small name and paid me some small amount of cash. Both of these were important factors in my career. They are important factors in the career of any young man, and those who affect to despise either are talking rubbish. Money and fame, if you go out after them without any other motive, are a pretty low aim. But if your goal is service or expressing yourself or making the world a better place in which to live, you will find that a respected name and a few dollars in your pocket will grease the runners considerably. You'll go farther with less strain on the traced chains, and you won't tire so easily on the first short hill. Meantime, there were influences in my environment that I did not reckon with, and yet that determined my life for me. Let me give you a notion of how environment seems to operate and do its work on the living individual, plant, animal, or man. It is not the duration of an environment that affects heredity. It is the amount of pressure exerted. The more sensitive the plant or the man, the more readily he takes the impression his surroundings or situation give off. It is all a matter of vibrations, a matter of response to vibrations. In no other way than through vibrations do we get anything. You know that the camera plate is struck with blows of light to burn into the sensitized surface the picture you want to take. If you make what is called a time exposure, the blows are gentle, but sooner or later they make a dent in the gelatin. The lighter parts are burned deeply, and the shadows and black places are only just touched. But it is the steady tap, tap, tap of the rays of light that do the work. We are all made, plants and fish and cats and elephants and men, of organisms built of tissue that is built of cells. The life force is in the cells. Plasm, made up of almost everything in the universe, is in infinitely minute particles. Now, because that protoplasm, which Huxley says is the basis of life, is made up of almost everything in nature, it responds to almost everything in nature. Protoplasm is the sensitized film on our body and intellectual plates. Vibrations from about us strike it, and gradually they make a dent. Repetition, repetition, repetition. That is the process by which environment bends and molds and directs and diverts and changes us. What does the great composer choose? Why does the great composer choose 2 or 3 little phrases of music and work them into his symphony in 1,000 different ways? Why does the orator use the same simple line again and again and again, playing with it, decorating it, embellishing it, speaking it in a low tone, then in an abrupt voice, then as a question? Why simply to carry his message home? We say, give a dog a bad name and you might better drown him. Because the badness of the dog is stressed day after day, month after month, until the whole neighborhood believes he is a bad. And after a while, the dog himself begins to figure that there may be something in the idea. Perhaps one of the first words I ever heard was California. Certainly, there must have been talk enough about this country, for the year before my birth was the year in which gold was discovered here, and in 10 or 12 years following immigration had set steadily from Certainly, there must have been talk enough about this country, for the year before my birth was the year in which gold was discovered here, and in the 10 or 12 years following immigration had set steadily this way from every part of the land. Moreover, my older brother George had come here in 1854, and his occasional letters — he was not a letter writer, but a man who did things and left the talking about them to others — undoubtedly fired the interest of the older people and the curiosity of the boys. All that I heard of California day after day, week after week, from every side and every source, even during a time and in a neighborhood where slavery and the strong will of the South were lively topics, impressed itself on my mind. I do not know that I ever suddenly announced my belief that California would be the place for a plant experiment to work with. Repetition, repetition, repetition struck the storied name on my consciousness until I was certain to go west, and I was to continue plant experimentation. This seems to me a happy moment to take one more step with you in the scientific course necessary to an understanding of much that I will write in these rambling papers on the work and memories of my years. Remember that I was a New England boy, bred and born. My heredity might have been supposed to keep me a New Englander, and my environment to double the urge. Instead, I am writing of the certainty that I would pull up stakes and go to California. Was the chance or an exception to the rule? Was that chance or an exception to the rule? Haven't I been saying that heredity gives us the foundation from which to build the environment, shapes, and designs the building? The explanation is simple. It relates so closely to all that is to come that I must give it to you here. In the first place, you must look considerably below the surface to determine just what your heredity, any heredity, actually is. For into it, through the long line behind you, have come many varied influences, and one of the most potent and revolutionary influences is that which results on the mingling of heredities through the mating of 2 sexes. We accept sex as a fact, and we accept the necessity for 2 sexes as a similar fact. But what did it ever occur to you to wonder why nature bothered to require two parents? I mean, by that question, to ask you to forget everything you know about the matter and consider it as though the whole plan of life were being instituted for the first time, and you were sitting in on the conference on ways and means. You would agree that there must be a law to compel the individual plants or dogfish or toadstool or lynx or ape or man to desire to live. Otherwise, the first discouragement met with would be the end of that enterprise. You would agree, secondly, that the individual must be compelled to want to reproduce himself, or else the job of starting him off would have to be done over and over again. So you would be unanimously in favor of the law of self-preservation and the secondary law of the perpetuation of the species. Very well. Why not let each individual leave a cell somewhere in a warm, protected spot and then lie down and die, assured that the nested cell would be born into a copy of the original, and the species or family would go right on? I don't think it was accidental, this arrangement that required two cells to meet and join and reproduce themselves in a new life. Not at all. I think it was for the very best reason that there is for anything in the miracle working of Mother Nature. I think it was because she knew that sameness, monotony, exact reduplication over and over again would make this world the dullest point of light in the whole universe. Nature required variations, change, development, growth. She may or may not have wanted improvement. There is a great quarrel among the scientists on that fine point, and I'll pass it by for the moment. She did demand change, variation, a constant blending of old stocks to make new forms, shapes, sizes, colors, and to make it possible for the individuals, whether plants or animals or humans, to move about and adjust themselves to new conditions, and so give the earth the diversification and interest that it has for us today. If the aster had recreated itself from one cell, it would have been an aster, and no power on earth could have developed it into a coriospis to the end of time. If the Burbanks had been blacksmiths and none of the strains brought into the family by the women they married had exerted their hereditary influence, I should have been a blacksmith, and probably a poor one, and nothing could have changed me or given me a different chance. Nature saw all that, and by the simplest and most adroit single stroke that the whole history of biology records make it possible, she went a step farther and attached certain penalties to the single cell or single strain method of reproduction, so that what we call inbreeding is known to be a very risky thing to try, and cousins who marry often bring forth weak or sickly or defective children. No, nature wanted variations, and she made it possible to have them from the very beginning. Indeed, made it pretty difficult not to have them. And there is something you won't find in the textbooks, and I think you will find it something worth musing over. This cunning provision nature made brings us back to my discussion of the influence of the environing gossip and excitement concerning California on my New England heredity. That heredity had in it not only the Burbank strain, but it had in it the pulls of my father's mother's heredity, and his grandmother's, and hers, and so on, back and back, until I was related distantly, perhaps, to half the white people in the world. More than that, it had in it the pull exerted by the heredity of my own mother, a Ross, and her people on both sides, spreading laterally and running through the tree of the families of earth. On her side, I was probably related to the other half of the world's white inhabitants. In short, I was a product of all my heredity. And Mark Twain was not altogether joking, maybe, when he said that he had to abandon his efforts at getting up a genealogical tree for himself when he discovered that it included a horse thief or two. If there wasn't a horse thief or an embezzling bank cashier somewhere in my line, I am certainly different from most folks. If you want to make a family tree that will really tell the whole story, you will have to go on below the ground. Something I noticed the genealogists are all too canny to do, and follow the roots from tap and anchor main stems through the laterals and branches to the very tiny little threads at the ends. And even then, you would only be starting your task. I had, you can see, a variety of influences on me that were purely hereditary. Who can say whence came the strain that responded so instantly to the repeated call of California? But it was there, and a tug of war probably went on, without my knowing it, between that strain and the hard-headed New England blood of me. For New Englanders are notoriously fixed and set sorts of folks. They are the oldest Americans. They are well satisfied where they are. They are conservative. They are not always chasing will-o'-the-wisps. Even their infamous seamen, wanderers, pioneers, and adventurers, though they are and always have been, usually come home. The New England heredity exerts a strong influence on all its youth to strike their roots still more deeply into the parents' soil. It was a battle between the conservative that said, stay where you are, and the radical that urged me to get out and go west. For you must not suppose that heredity is only a matter of red hair or speaking German or bearing a family resemblance to your father and grandfather. Heredity is also a matter of ideas, ideals, habits of thought, points of view, temperament, and all the other mental and intellectual aspects of man. The heredity of the Navajo Indian is not only toward a lean, long frame, an aquiline nose, and a natural ability as a hunter and a horseman, but it is toward being a wanderer. The heredity of the Hopi Indian is not only toward being shorter, squattier, heavier, slower, and broad-nosed, but it is toward being a town dweller, and a trader, with a timid sort of agriculture on the side. You see, we are a bundle of hereditary strains and tendencies. Environment may play on one or two and not on the others, or it may act strongly on half a dozen or all of your inborn characteristics. In my case, some untraced tendency was toward movement away from the home place. My sensitized plate was struck repeatedly by influences leading toward California. I had no choice in the matter. I was bound to go. Now we come to another very important influence that operates on our hereditary tendencies to change and modify and direct them into new channels, the influence of education. Education is a form of environment, an intellectual environment that is as definitely molding and directing as the pressure of a rock on a plant to force it to creep towards the light, or of a spring of water to give it strength to grow taller than its kind. I'm not speaking of my education by books in the schools. I am a good deal of a crank about the education of children, and probably I won't be able to contain myself on that subject as we go on. Right now, I have in mind the influence on me of the greatest scientific thinker of our age, the man who changed the whole meaning and language of science, Charles Darwin. In Lancaster, I had got a hold of a book of his, The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication. It opened a new world to me. It told me, in plain simple sentences, as matter of fact as though its marvelous and startling truths were commonplaces, that variations came from crossbreeding, and that these variations seemed to be susceptible, through selection, of permanent fixture in the individual. While I had been struggling along with my experiments, blundering on half-truths and truths, The great master had been reasoning out causes and effects for me and setting them down in orderly fashion, easy to understand, and having an immediate bearing on my work. I doubt if it is possible to make anyone realize what this book meant to me. Big as this book was, and significant as it was to me, its influence over me was heightened, and its lure for me was increased by the uproar with which its author's theories were received. In 1859, Darwin had published The Origin of Species, and just when the variations of plants and animals under domestication was stirring me all up, he shook the world with his Descent of Man. Almost immediately the storm broke, especially in the New England churches and homes. The theory that man had descended from an ancestry common to that of apes. Darwin never said anything about his descending from monkeys, was blasphemous, scurrilous, infamous, and other things even worse. Darwin was banned from the churches and from most homes, and those who read him were considered as bad as he was. Perhaps I always furnished the government, as they say. At any rate, the man everyone was discussing and most of them were damning was for the very reason interesting to me, and the controversy, a rather one-sided one in our neighborhood, I remember, since there were few to defend him, only served to inflame my interest in every word he wrote. The blows his personality and phrases struck on my sensitive mind were steady, sharp, and persistent. My New England heredity was outweighed by the pressure of my environment. The talk of California, the furor against Darwin, and his clear and illuminating book, and I pushed out and away. I check myself here to be sure that I'm telling the whole story, and a little guilty feeling comes over me. The fact is, there was an immediate cause for the ultimate act of serving home ties and setting out for the West. I am sure now, and I think I was sure a few months after my arrival in California, that I was certainly destined to make the break. But if I had been asked as I boarded my train for the great adventure, just why I was going so far away, with such apparent suddenness, I should have replied sadly that it was on account of an unrequited love. Unrequited love. The story of this early romance of mine had crept into the newspapers now and again. The truth is that I was very deeply fond of a beautiful young lady who seemed to me, I remember, less ardent than I was. A trifling disagreement, two positive natures, probably hasty words, and I determined that my heart was broken. To be frank, I think I gave that affair to many as my reason for coming west. Mary and I can look back now on those tragic days, for I'm sure they were tragic to both of us, with smiles. Shortly after my arrival from California, I wrote her, or she wrote me, and we resumed our friendship by letter. The friendship has been kept up all these years and has been very significant to both of us. Probably my Mary of those old times has had many an occasion to be thankful that I took her at her word when she told me, as I think she must have, that I was not the only eligible young man in Massachusetts. There is the story, in a few words, of the early romance that drove me west. It was the proximate cause, probably, the turning point. And it was rather heroic and romantic to use as an excuse for this dramatic move in my life. I find on looking back through letters written home at the time, and on considering all the facts, that there was another motive behind my decision. Although I am not at all sure that I was conscious of it at the time. There are in those first Californian letters several references to the sense of freedom California gave me, and now I can say that I was undoubtedly influenced by a desire to be on my own, to be my own man, unadvised by family or friends, and no longer compelled to explain or apologize for my choice of work or the methods I employed in getting at it. There are, I have observed, many proverbial adages that tell only a half truth, if that much. One of them is the saying that a rolling stone gathers no moss. It may be a fact that the young man who doesn't know his own mind about a life work and who is always jumping from one thing to another will never get anywhere on the straight, long road. But I'm not so sure that this isn't due to the maladjustment to his environment rather than to his instability. On the other hand, the stone that is planted in the home field and never stirs from there is pretty certain to gather nothing but moss and so to become that other proverbial monstrosity, a mossback. My belief is that you will find most of the men in the world who have accomplished something have done a considerable amount of rolling in their time, and have gathered a large amount of the varieties of moss that are most useful to us all. Experience, adjustability, adaptability, facility, acquaintance, breadth of view and vision, and the chance to learn just what it is in the work of the world that is the most useful for us to do. I do not insist that all young men and women should up stakes and move, or that those who do so are bound and certain to succeed just because of that. But I do maintain that the law of change, variation, new environments, and new developments in the individual as a result is a definite law of life. I am a poor hand at forcing advice on anyone, and particularly on the young. But I will say that if you present surroundings or environments or situation But I will say, if your present surroundings or environment or situation seems to you to hamper and restrain and hobble you, a sharp break with it, a sharp break with all that is old and settled and habitual to you may save you from becoming a cog or a barnacle. It was in 1875 that the stories of the West, Darwin, my unconscious sense of restraint in New England, and Mary sent me packing. I was 26 years old, a small, wiry, active young man, observant, alert, inquisitive, and full of ideas about what I was going to do. A few very definite fundamental laws of nature were fixed in my mind as a basis on which to build. I had read more science than most youths of my acquaintance, and all that I had read had been illuminated and crystallized for me by Darwin. In my luggage, I had 10 Burbank potatoes that I had been permitted to retain when I had sold the new variety to a New England seedsman. They were to be the foundation of my fortune and the beginning of my fame. I meant to round out both fortune and fame. It was some years later, before I reached a turn in my road, where I had to decide between them and my work. This was an interesting chapter in these papers that must come in its turn. For the moment I was pretty definitely fixed in my ambition, and the bigger, broader, more important meaning of life hadn't come to me. I expect that the first person singular of the personal pronoun was the one I employed most in my thoughts, whether I used it in a conversation or not. That one-letter word, I. For some years now, I have been more proud than of any other one thing in my career that I have deleted at least 1,000,000 I's from my own manuscripts or from those prepared about me by others. Here they keep cropping up like the blotches in measles. They tell me that in such papers as these they cannot be avoided. I shrink a little from each one of them. I've been so long accustomed to fighting them off, but perhaps one can get used to them. Whitman used them more than any other man, perhaps, who ever lived. He said he was preaching himself to the world because he did not think he was far different in his nature and reactions from the general rule of men. And turning to an old and well-loved volume, I find Henry David Thoreau boldly stating his same case in these words, in his book called Walden. I should not obtrude my affairs so much on the notice of my readers if very particular inquiries had not been made by my townsmen concerning my mode of life. In most books, the first person is omitted. In this, it will be retained that, in respect to egotism, is the main difference. We commonly do not remember that it is, after all, always the first person that is speaking. I should not talk so much about myself if there were anybody else whom I knew as well. Unfortunately, I am confined to this theme by the narrowness of my experience. Moreover, I, on my side, require of every writer, first or last, a simple account of his own life, and not merely what he has heard of other men's lives. Some such account as he would send to his kindred from a distant land. For if he has lived sincerely, it must have been in a distant land to me. This is good. I will write of this harvest of years. This is good. I will write of this harvest of the years of mine to you, my kindred, as though from a distant land.